As a principle, there are three things I never argue with anyone about: religion, politics, and sport. This is because most people hold really strong beliefs that are rooted in their own personal experiences. And trying to understand the context of that said belief or their conviction is impossible over a single conversation. The latter two, that is politics and sport, have historically been interlinked. This isn't a new phenomenon, and human history is peppered or littered, depending on your perspective, with examples of a torrid affair between sport and politics. Our keynote speaker for the day, Mr. Mukul Kesavan, a historian, novelist, and essayist, has taken it upon himself to help us navigate patriotism and nationalism in sport. Mukul?
Thank you. First off, I'd like to thank the Go Sports Foundation and Nandan Kamath, and especially Roshan Gopalkrishna, who put this all together for me, for the invitation to speak here. And let me also say that, off topic, this is the most extraordinary space. Coming into the Bangalore International Center, I was struck by how evolved and beautiful this is as a piece of architecture. When Roshan wrote to me about the nature of the audience, he stressed the fact that this was at least substantially an audience of lawyers, people interested in law and policy, vis-a-vis sport. So it's only fair that I tell you where I'm coming from. I teach history and I follow sport, not necessarily in that order. And my talk today really is going to be from the point of view of someone who's interested in the historical context of sport, and also someone who watches competitive sport with kind of mindless passion and continuously. And so often the way in which people like me who have not played sport at any seriously competitive level respond to sport is often not particularly interesting or insightful. But what I hope to try and do is to try and understand this topic, and the topic is navigating patriotism and nationalism in sport. I hope to try and understand it both from a context that's historical and from the point of view of someone who is, if you will, a spectator or a fan. I'd like to shorten the title to Navigating Nationalism in Sport, because the distinction between patriotism and nationalism is incredibly hard to pin down. I mean, how do you tell the difference between a benign pride in belonging and a kind of swaggering nationalism? I mean, that distinction is so subjective that it's impossible to use it as an interesting category of analysis. On the other hand, I like the word navigating because it suggests that we have to be careful not to make sweeping generalizations about our subject. I suspect the reason, at least one of the reasons why we are talking about this subject today is because of the Indian cricket team's very visible donning of military-style camouflage caps in a recent international match. That and MS Dhoni's run-in with the ICC when he was asked to remove regimental insignia from his wicket-keeping gloves during the World Cup. Along with that, of course, we saw both the BCCI and the Committee of Administrators bid to have Pakistan removed, in a sense, from international cricket competition on the ground of harboring terrorists, which is clearly an attempt by India's cricketing establishment to voice nationalist outrage through sporting sanctions. When Orwell wrote in the Tribune in 1936 that sport was war minus the shooting, he couldn't have hoped for a more literal illustration of that now famous maxim than Dhoni's 4G fixation. I think for many people who were witness to this, there was something faintly embarrassing about uniformed cricketers playing it being soldiers, because war is a serious business and sport in some ways not in the same way. Or rather, sport, perhaps it's more accurate to take Dhoni's sport, in saying that cricket is a serious business, literally, as in money, but not as in dying for your country. Still, it's probably a mistake to move from a kind of distaste for a swaggering nationalism affected by some sportsmen in this time of sort of drum-beating chauvinism to the idea that the virtuous alternative is a sattvic enthusiasm for sport uninflected by nationalist feeling. I suspect so many of us are willing to believe this idea that you can be enthusiastic about sport without making it toxic with nationalism is because of our personal experiences of some kinds of sports. So, for example, I'm thinking of a sport like tennis, where individual excellence seems to transcend, in a sense, or for all of us as spectators, national affiliation, or a sport like football, where leagues based on clubs and franchises have sort of, to a very large extent, displaced national sports in the battle for television audiences and revenues. As spectators and fans, we remember loyalties and attachments that have nothing to do with national affiliation. It could be the delight in watching Nadal or Federer, or it could be the kind of tribal loyalty to a football club like Arsenal that seems to have nothing to do, in a sense, with national solidarity. Now, these are important differences, and they remind us that the nation doesn't actually have a monopoly on the way in which sport is shaped. They also tell us that the catch-all term that we use, namely sport, gathers up competitions of very, very different kinds. So what they remind us is that easy generalizations are something to be resisted when we are talking about this catch-all category that we describe, sport and its relationship with nationalism. But despite this, it's difficult to separate modern competitive sport and nationalism because they're actually constituted by each other. National feeling is not a kind of external add-on to sport that's been injected into it by administrators or players or politicians or a predatory media. Nationalism is native to modern sport. It's built into its historical evolution. As early as 1908, which is more than 110 years ago, athletes at the Olympics became representatives of their nations as opposed to individual competitors. Before we think about doing something about nationalism and sport, we need to understand how thoroughly sport is embedded in the nation and why it's so hard to separate the two. The wisest paragraph on sport was written by arguably one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, an English social historian called E.J. Hobsbawm. He wrote, quote, "What has made sport uniquely effective as a medium for inculcating national feelings, at all events for males, which is an important qualification, is the ease with which even the least political or public individual can identify with the nation as symbolized by young persons excelling at something practically every man wants to be good at. The imagined community of millions seems more real as a team of 11 named people." Unquote. Hobsbawm is making two large points here. One, that sport is the best way of socializing people into nationalism because it's easier to identify with 11 recognizable players than a large abstraction. And two, this is an important point that we don't have enough time to deal with, but I think should be raised. Two, that this identification with the nation via sport is actually historically gendered, which is to say that sports-induced nationalism has been historically an all-male communion. Let's talk about that first point. Hobsbawm tips his hat at another great historian, Benedict Anderson, by using his master concept, imagined community, as a way of describing the nation. By stressing that a nation is imagined, Anderson found a memorable way of saying that the nation wasn't an objectively given thing, but that it was a feeling, a subjective sense of political community, which is historically built, or to use the word that Hobsbawm used, inculcated from the 19th century onwards. Hobsbawm is suggesting that modern sport, in conjunction with modern media, are a vital part of the nation building process. He's saying that sport is, to say this again, constitutive of nationalism. It's not the cherry on the cake. It's baked into the foundations of the nation state. And it's not a coincidence, therefore, that the period between 1870 and 1914, when the balance of power between empires and nation states in Europe and elsewhere was shifting, when Germany and Italy and Japan began to reorganize themselves as nations, is also the period when modern sports formalized their rules, set up regulatory associations, and established international competitions that identified athletes and sportsmen primarily as representatives of nations. The first international test match, as most of you probably know, was played in 1877. This wasn't, strictly speaking, a match played between nations. Rather, it was a match played between, if you will, the mother country, which is Britain, and its dominion, Australia. But the important thing to remember is just the idea of playing against England helped Australians, who were, if you will, a colonial state, imagine the possibility of Australia. In exactly the same way, there was a cricket team an all India cricket team, as it was known, that toured England in 1911. And this was a tour that had been many years in the making. And Prashant Kidambi has a wonderful book on this called Cricket Country, in which he explains how trying to assemble this team together, full of people who lived in a subcontinental polity, who were very different, who were Dalits, who were Muslims, who were upper caste Hindus, who were Parsis, that assembling this team together in a curious way begins to create the idea of a pluralist India. But the relationship between newly formalized competitive sport and the nation is much, obviously, larger than cricket. FIFA, football's governing association, was founded in 1904 to regulate international competition. The governing bodies for football, cricket, and tennis were set up within 10 years of each other, between 1904 and 1914. Even a sport as individualistic as tennis was nudged into nationalist competition by the Davis Cup in 1900, which begins life as a kind of national competition between England on the one hand and America on the other. Even more central to the developing relationship between nationalism and sport than these international tournaments, organized by these brand new sporting bodies, was the nationalization of the Olympic Games. We had Abhinav here, who is a kind of living testament to the significance of the Olympic Games as far as national pride is concerned. These revived games, revived by Baron Coubertin, were imagined by him as a festival of sort of fraternal brotherhood, where the best athletes in the world would compete against each other in a sporting lull, rather like the ancient Olympic Games, where warring kingdoms would observe a truce for the duration of the Olympics. What emerged, of course, is rather different. Till 1908, entry to the Olympic Games was not restricted by national Olympic committees. Mixed teams, for example, participated in team events, mixed in the sense that they were made up of athletes who belonged to more than one nation. But from 1908 onwards, the International Olympic Association consisted entirely of representatives of sovereign states. The Olympics began with a march past of nations, each under its own placard. Alan Berner has written, and I think accurately, quote, "Sport, more than any other form of social activity in the modern world, facilitates flag waving and the playing of national anthems. The Olympics, more than any other sporting event, has pioneered this non-stop identification between sport and the nation." I mean, there have been times when athletes have competed not under a national flag, but perhaps under the flag of the National Olympic Association or under the International Olympic Association's flags. This has generally happened when there's been a period of national transition, say new nation states are emerging, or if there's been a kind of boycott and the Olympic Games takes, if you will, a benign view of the desire to circumvent this boycott. But every time an individual athlete has asked to compete in the Olympic Games as an individual, for example, there was a sprinter from Guyana called Gilkes, who, during the boycott of the Moscow Olympics, asked to compete as an individual, this was completely forbidden. There's a sense in which the Olympic Games completely stands by the idea that it is a competition between nation states. And in fact, when I look back upon half a century of memories of watching Olympic Games or reading about them, it's sort of hard to be supercilious or condescending about hyper-nationalist fandom. It's almost embarrassing to acknowledge that without nationalist narratives, the excitement of the individual striving so close to Coubertin's heart and the ideal of the Olympics would have completely passed me by. People in this audience, you're not old enough if you're 35, but people in this audience who are old enough to remember the Cold War will also remember how ideological polarization helped spectators like me pick sides. So the Americans rejoiced when Nadia Comaneci scored all those perfect tens in gymnastics because it helped beat the Soviet gymnast Olga Korbut, because Romania was, in a sense, an Eastern Bloc country that was dissident, that was opposed to the Soviet bloc. In the same way, someone like Teofilo Stevenson, who was a kind of jewel in Cuba's crown, was very much a kind of national emblem. Indians remember how the decline of our hockey teams in the medal rankings was a kind of narrative of nationalist heartbreak. Yes, there were moments of transcendence which had nothing to do with your ideological or nationalist solidarity with the athlete in question. The 68 games were especially extraordinary because you have Bob Beamon literally smashing the long jump record to smithereens as he kind of sailed in Mexico's high altitude environment to an impossible jump. You also had Dick Fosbury and the sheer miraculous absurdity of someone jumping backwards in the high jump, which had never been done before, the Fosbury flop, which completely transformed the nature of that particular event. But outside of these, the Olympics taught us that individual striving made coherent, connected sense only in the service of national glory. Notionally, the Olympics are awarded to cities, which I guess is a kind of gesture at the idea of the ancient Greek city-state. But in effect, from Berlin in 1936 to Beijing in 2008, the Olympics have always been extravagant ways for a nation to put its best foot forward. Now, there's a contradiction or an apparent contradiction at the heart of the Olympian vision of sporting competition that complicates all sports, because all sports, in lesser or greater measure, take their cue from Coubertin's ideals. And the contradiction is this. On the one hand, the Olympics hardwires the nation state into modern competition. On the other, the International Olympic Association insists that it will brook no interference from national politicians in the autonomy of national Olympic committees. So the relevant instruction reads, quote, members of the IOC will not accept from governments any mandate or instructions which are against the principles of the Olympic Charter, unquote. This position is replicated by most international associations like FIFA or the Federation for International Hockey. Cricket has been something of a laggard in this respect, but the BCCI, for example, has been fighting a rearguard action for nearly a decade to stay out of the purview of the Right to Information Act because it argues that it's a private body. And the Indian state periodically tries to regulate the BCCI as a public body precisely because it selects a team that claims to represent India. Now, the ideal of autonomy grows out of the liberal idea that the nation state has a demarcated sphere that does not extend to the freedom of action of civil society organizations. The regulatory bodies for sport are implicitly saying that they want to harness the cachet of the nation state to magnify the significance of sport, but they won't have the functionaries of the nation state intervene in the affairs of their national affiliates. Now, the ostensible reason for this is the need to keep sport free of political interference, or indeed of politics itself. When 6 nations withdrew in protest over the Hungarian invasion and the Suez Crisis from the 1956 Olympics, Avery Brundage, who was, in a sense, the largest figure in Olympic administration for many, many decades, an American, admonished these 6 countries. He said, quote, "These countries show that they are unaware of one of our most important principles, namely that sport is completely free of politics," unquote. There's something heroic about Brundage's magnificent disregard for the facts of international sport. Brundage was the same man who 20 years earlier had argued against the boycott of the Berlin Olympics, as many civil society organizations in America had suggested, because of the Nazi persecution of the Jews. But there was, however, a strange and consistent logic to his insistence that boycotts were political, whereas racist persecution was not. What Brundage and every advocate of the autonomy of sports associations is saying is that the nation state, as the sole sovereign representative of its people, transcends politics. In an international setting, therefore, the internal politics of a nation can be of no concern to a sporting association, but reciprocally, the politicians of a nation state must not impose their politics on international sport. Now, Brundage's position was sustainable only by turning a blind eye to routine violations of the Olympic Charter. For example, the amateur ethic that Brundage was so committed to, which he doggedly defended, was flagrantly disregarded by many countries, including many countries of the erstwhile Eastern Bloc, where athletes who were, to all intents and purposes, professional, who were paid actually to do nothing but train, were dignified with the title of soldier and student just so that they could participate in the Olympic Games as amateurs. But though Brundage's time is past and amateurism is history, his idea that the nation is above politics in matters of sport, that its transcendent status requires unwavering acknowledgement, flourishes in contexts other than the Olympic Games. Fahad Mustafa, in an excellent piece, has a sharp Hobsbawmian take on Indian cricket. And he has a lovely sentence where he says, quote, "Cricket in India," he writes, "made nationhood a consumable entity," unquote. A team sport like cricket is a perfect candidate for nationalist framing. David Gellner helps us unpack Mustafa's aphorism. Team sport, he says, gives full play to individual prowess while simultaneously allowing international competition and systematic, ongoing, never-ending comparison. Whatever the past, there's always hope for the future. Whatever the dire state of the national team in the present, there are usually proud memories somewhere in the past, unquote. The first time I read Gellner's sentence, I felt a shock of recognition. Every middle-aged Indian cricket tragic knows exactly what I mean. In the distant 20th century, when India lost to cricket much more than it won, we salvaged consolation from the wreckage of defeat by lingering on heroic individual performances. So no matter how comprehensively we might be thrashed by an Australian team in the future, no one can take the glory of that 2-1 victory circa 2001 away from us. Now, the flip side of this near absolute twinning of cricket and the nation is that cricketing loyalty becomes a patriotic litmus test. In 1990, Norman Tebbit famously came up with the cricket test for measuring an immigrant's commitment to his new nation. Immigrants who cheered for their country of origin instead of England failed that test. A more virulent version of Tebbit's test has been in circulation in India since independence and partition. This was explicitly aimed at Indian Muslims whose loyalties were vulnerable to challenge because of the creation of a Muslim state. This touchstone for telling patriots from traitors was given new lease of life when stories of disaffected Kashmiri Muslim spectators cheering opposing teams in international matches played in Srinagar began to circulate in the closing decades of the 20th century. The equation of sporting disloyalty with treachery and treason illustrates how representative sport creates a national communion where every citizen must be a celebrant and where refuseniks must therefore be punished. everyone in this room is familiar with the famous or infamous sportsman who refused to give the nation its due. The most famous of these, of course, was Muhammad Ali, who refused to be drafted into the US Army and the Vietnam War and was imprisoned for it. And he's the obvious example. But in a way, the example most relevant to us today as we speak about the relationship between nationalism and sport is perhaps the descent of Tommy Smith and Juan Carlos, two American sprinters who made the Black Power salute after placing first and third in the 200-meter sprint in the Mexico Games. They raised their fists and bowed their heads and stayed silent as the Star-Spangled Banner, the anthem of the United States, played. For this, they were stripped of their medals, expelled from the Olympic Village, and endured death threats for years. Newspapers in America compared them to Nazis. Smith was discharged from the army. A stone was thrown through a plate glass window in the room where his baby slept in a crib. We are familiar with this story. Our old friend Avery Brundage, who had defended the raising of the Nazi salute in the Berlin Games of 1936, denounced the Black Power salute and steadfastly maintained that he was being principled and consistent. The Nazi salute, he argued without irony, had been a national salute in 1936 and therefore acceptable in a competition of nations, whereas the Black Power salute wasn't and had to be denounced. Brundage's response speaks directly to our theme today. It tells us that the fetishization of nationalism is so intrinsic to modern sport that an American sports administrator, decades after the Holocaust, could uphold without ridicule or indeed self-awareness the legitimacy of the Nazi salute while outraging about a symbolic protest against racism and poverty and violence. We also know, of course, that after decades of isolation, Smith and Carlos were rehabilitated. Disgrace, retrospectively, became reverence, and their story became a narrative of redemption. Statues were raised to them to honor them as civil rights heroes. Brundage and the Americans who turned on Smith and Carlos appear to all of us here in this room as Neanderthals, as bigots, marooned on the wrong side of history. But history moves at different speeds in different countries, and it doesn't always move in a straight line. In 2016, Colin Kaepernick, a black quarterback in the National Football League, stopped standing for the American national anthem. He chose to kneel instead in protest against the violence suffered by African Americans in the United States. Donald Trump denounced Kaepernick, as did NFL franchise owners, and NFL fans reacted with fury and disapproval. At this distance, to all of us, it seemed like a replay of the reaction to the 1968 protests. One way of bringing these American examples of offenses against the nation closer home is to imagine them happening here. What if Smith and Carlos's protests and Kaepernick's refusal to stand for the anthem was replicated by Indian protesters during a medal ceremony or a flag raising or a performance of the Indian national anthem? For the sake of this thought experiment, it's useful to actually recall the detail of Smith and Carlos's protest. They wore no shoes to symbolize the poverty in which black Americans lived. Carlos wore a necklace of black beads to symbolize African Americans who had been lynched or thrown off ships in the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage used to be the journey between Africa and America in slave ships. Imagine the reaction from fans, fellow athletes, administrators, and public figures if Indian sportspersons symbolically protested acts of violent bigotry or oppression in India. It's an interesting exercise, especially if we want to work out what to do about the relationship between nationalism and sport, if we want to navigate it, as it were. What if an Indian woman athlete followed Kaepernick in refusing to stand for the national anthem in protest against the epidemic of sexual violence against women in India? In the context of unfolding mayhem, for example, in Unnao, and the epidemic of sexual violence in this country, This is not inconceivable. What if a Dalit athlete was to do what Tommy Smith did to protest the manual scavengers dying in septic tanks, or to mark the beating to death of Dalit cattle traders or leather workers for alleged cattle thieving? I suspect that the nation state, being a jealous god, would not be happy. And its displeasure might be echoed and amplified by fans, administrators, and the guardians of the nation state. In conclusion, I'd just like to explore the chances of the sports media complex finding ways of organizing and watching sport that don't turn on national identity. At the start of this talk, I mentioned professional league sports as a form of competition that might challenge or even subvert the nation's stranglehold on the sporting imagination. This is an argument that's often aired. The argument is that club football in Europe has created forms of tribal loyalty that have displaced nationalism as the principle of solidarity amongst football's following. Football in Europe today is principally a club sport with national competition thrown in as an occasional indulgence and pleasure. Might the Indian Premier League, patterned on professional sports leagues in America with a stipulated number of teams and franchises, help cricket evolve from a sport where the highest form of the game is organized around international competition to a football-type circumstance? Where fans pledge their main loyalties to franchises as football's fanatical followers pledge them to football teams like Liverpool and Barcelona? Where the economy of the game and its livelihoods comes to center on the league game, which displaces international competition into an occasional pleasure, thereby marginalizing nationalism as the moving spirit behind cricket. Some of this is happening already. The IPL is the goose that lays Indian cricket's golden eggs. It offers wealth beyond the dreams of avarice for a much larger pool of players than ever before. It has created professional franchise teams where the citizens of several countries play as teammates. One of the most endearing things about the recent World Cup was the camaraderie between many players from different teams and different countries simply because they had participated in the IPL together or had been teammates there. More and more players like Chris Gayle and Mohammad Amir have made it clear that they see the lucrative shortest form of the game as their principal vocation. It's also clear that the ICC and cricket's governing bodies are doing their best to accommodate this form of 2020 league cricket. I mean, the present proposal to create a test championship to give context and meaning to test matches. I'm not sure what meaning you need to give to a bilateral contest like a test match, but this notion that you're going to give it context and meaning is a euphemistic way of saying, how can we cut this form of test cricket down to a manageable number of days so that the stuff that people really want to watch and play can be fitted in? So is it time for aficionados of test cricket like me and many others to reckon with the uncomfortable fact that it's their preferred form of cricket that is fueled by nationalism? Whereas the shortest form of the game, often derided as a form of showbiz rather than sport, is the form that is transforming cricket into a professional sport. One where skilled cricketers, freed from national structures, become travelling mercenaries or professionals and sell their services to the highest bidder, helping cricket's fans switch their loyalties from the nation to the club or the franchise. It's a plausible idea, and I've aired this myself, but I think it's based on an inappropriate comparison. We shouldn't be comparing the IPL to the English Premier League. The proper analogy is another football code on another continent, America's NFL or the National Football League. Like the IPL in India, the NFL is a huge country's highest grossing league. Like the NFL, the bulk of the IPL spectators, and therefore its revenues, are local. It only needs Indian eyeballs. The NFL, like nearly all American leagues, whether it's baseball or basketball, is a domestic competition played between local teams staffed with mainly American players. And here's the thing. The absence of international competition and the absence of national teams makes no difference to the superheated militarist nationalism that virtually defines the game. Like America, India is a continental nation, large enough to have an insular celebration of itself through a sport in the absence of other countries. The NFL is a good way of thinking about the future of nationalism in Indian cricket because it demonstrates how much scope there is for militaristic chauvinism in a domestic league in a democratic country. It's also an illustration of the ways in which corporate media, politicians, celebrity players, fans, and franchise owners use nationalism as a kind of magic sauce to grow the game and make it and everyone involved in it richer. While baseball was seen as America's national pastime and an emblem of its exceptionalism, militant nationalism comes to American sport when the NFL surges in popularity in the 1960s and 1970s. With its helmeted warriors, its focus on capturing and holding ground, football of the American sort becomes the perfect receptacle for a militarist nationalism in a time of war. Remember, these are also the decades of the Vietnam War and its immediate aftermath. To this day, NFL games feature fighter jet flypasts, the celebration of military veterans, and military honor guards. There are salute to service games held by each one of the 32 teams in the NFL every year, where, and this is particularly relevant to us, where every player wears a sticker representing the designated military service branch on his helmet. In the NFL, wearing military fatigue caps in the games the Indian team did would be par for the course. The NFL would understand MS Dhoni's keenness on a uniform nationalism completely, and his attachment to the territorial army wouldn't even be remarked on. NFL players and coaches routinely tore military bases. In fact, there was a journalistic scoop where it was discovered that the US Department of Defense was actually funding the NFL to boost the American military. Not that the NFL needed much encouragement. It's the ownership of the franchises is overwhelmingly Republican, as is its audience. Its audience is overwhelmingly white. Within the game, when Kaepernick took a knee, there was massive disapproval. No team picked him. Subsequently, in fact, he had to go to court to get an out-of-court settlement about discrimination against him for his political ideas. NFL games are the most lucrative commercial spots in American television. The 4 channels that run them have no incentive to either assess or critique the NFL or speak dispassionately about its workings. If you remember, Pat Tillman, who used to play for the Arizona Cardinals, joined the army and was killed in Afghanistan by friendly fire. The NFL television networks in the US Army put out a completely concocted narrative of gallantry and heroism that the NFL hasn't recanted to this day. The reason the NFL is relevant to our discussion is that it gives the lie to the glib idea that franchise league sport denationalizes a sport. It might do, as league football has done in Europe, but I think the NFL is the better precedent and parallel for the IPL. The NFL gives us some sense of how far down the road sport can travel. Will the IPL and Indian cricket make the same journey? It's hard to say, but India's 24/7 news channels have suggested that there's no downside to patriotism. Ratings soar. Nationalism is a proven force multiplier in India's media environment. Also, there's no brake mechanism within Indian cricket to stop this from happening. The players seem up to it, as the fatigue cap seems to suggest. The team's charismatic leaders, like Dhoni and Kohli, are front and center in this patriotic rebranding. Cricket's officialdom has shown itself to be exceptionally patriotic. Vinod Rai of the Committee of Administrators was even keener than the Indian government to punish Pakistan after Pulwama. Besides, the traffic between cricket and politics has steadily grown. Gautam Gambhir is only the latest cricketer to become a legislator, and he, like his predecessors, favors an emphatically nationalist politics. I don't think it'll be a huge surprise to anyone here if Dhoni's retirement includes a political career. If the IPL and Indian cricket go the NFL way, we are in for interesting times. If cricketing arenas become platforms for the staging of nationalism, the corresponding temptation to use these arenas to stage dissent will grow. Embracing the nation state invites the risk of Kaepernickian, if you will, challenges. I worry about the consequence of that. Living as we do in a hyper-nationalist world, living as we do within a Leviathan that periodically devours its anti-national young to grow. some storms aren't navigable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kesavan. May I request Nandan Kamath, Director of SLPC, to present Mukul with a memento.